I think we can get started. More people will join, but let's go for it. So let me start by welcoming everyone. It's awesome. First the speakers, Tarrence. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the audience for being there. So maybe a reminder: insider chats are really it's a monthly space with awesome guests. The idea is really to get and filter inside on the Starknet ecosystem. We've covered already some great topics. Today we'll be very focused on gaming and autonomous mode with Tarrence. Tarrence is the co-founder and CEO of Cartridge. Welcome to the space.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
My first question will, of course, be Terence, to just ask you for a quick intro. Before that, I'll let people know that at some point in the space, Oli from the Argent team will be sharing a SPOC. So SPOC is a Starknet proof of kudos, a proof of your attendance in the space. So keep an eye in the chat room of the space, and Oli will share a link. Okay, I see that it's Tom. He just shared the link to a special SPOC for attending this space. So let's focus on Tarrence now. Tarrence, a few words. Who are you? Where are you coming from?
Sure. So, hey everyone, I'm Tarrence. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cartridge and the core contributor to Dojo. We started Cartridge about a year and a half ago now to focus on building fully on-chain games in autonomous worlds, primarily in the Starknet ecosystem. It was kind of a continuation of some previous work that we were doing as part of the Dope Wars ecosystem that we started about 2 years ago, which is an on-chain gaming ecosystem. And as part of that, we started building a fully on-chain game, which is a recreation of a classic game called Drug Wars that we actually have a playable version of, the latest version that we couldn't produce 2 years ago. And the reason why we started Cartridge to address a lot of the challenges that we had in building that, which is actually live today for playtesting. So we can share a link to that if anyone is interested in experiencing and seeing what fully on-chain games look like. But anyways, my background is mostly technical, and we've been spending a lot of time building different tooling infrastructure and products, and as well as different content in on-chain gaming space. And I've been an Argent user since 2017, so I'm a big fan of the Argent team and their innovation in the account abstraction, even though I've paid a lot in fees on mainnet.
That's very good to know.
But yeah,
actually,
glad to be here.
No, that's very cool. Actually, yeah, I think Tarrence, we've known each other for, I would say a year and a half, probably, around the same time as you started Cartridge. But something that I actually never asked you is, what were you doing before that? I mean, I know you came, through the Dope Wars ecosystem, but before that, have you been building on blockchain for a while, or what have you been doing for the time before building on Starknet and building Cartridge and Dope Wars?
So I've been involved in the blockchain space for quite a while. I actually learned about Bitcoin when I was attending the University of Michigan. Cameron Hijazi is actually in the CMN spaces. He's one of the people that first introduced me to Bitcoin, and I've been involved in varying capacities ever since then. I started, found out about Ethereum. It was launched in 2015. Around that time, started writing some Solidity smart contracts. Nothing particularly interesting. Just trying to still wrap my head around the capabilities. I started a company in the blockchain space around DAO tooling in, I think it was maybe like 2017 before that bull run. And then outside of that, I've had more traditional software engineering background. I spent a few years at a SaaS company, and then I spent a few years at a company called Magic Leap, which produces mixed reality glasses. I was doing deep learning research there on computer vision research for mixed reality experiences, so things like 3D world construction. So kind of have a bunch of different experiences in different domains, but one of the constants has been my involvement in the blockchain space over that time in various capacities.
Okay, that's very cool. I mean, on blockchain, whether it's Dope Wars or it's Cartridge or Dojo, it's focused on-chain gaming. Were you a gamer before that? I mean, why focusing on gaming and not other aspects of blockchain technology?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a gamer my whole life. Is kind of was what got me into software development when I was very young. Started out playing like hex editing, Diablo 2, like, and I don't know, this was maybe like 2003 or something, like a long time ago. And then like modding different games and just like being curious about, the process of creating games. And that's kind of was one of my entry points into becoming a software engineer. I continued, played a lot of games, particularly World of Warcraft. I spent a lot of time in my teenage years playing that. But lately, obviously, a little bit less. I've now been more focused on building games, and as replaced in large part by playing games is now just contributing to the ecosystem and building games. So yeah, I mean, definitely a long time gamer, and I think like where we're operating right now with Cartridge is like an incredibly exciting place to be for me, particularly because it's a culmination of so many of my different interests. I think we're building like some of the coolest technology in the most exciting space. So it's a lot of fun.
It definitely is. Can you mentioned, I mean, in the introduction, Cartridge and then Dojo. Can you explain in a bit more details what Cartridge is exactly? I mean, what's your long-term vision for Cartridge? Because you mentioned that you're using that to actually build a lot of the stuff that you realized was needed while building the door course. But what's exactly I would say the vision of Cartridge? You envision it being in a couple of years.
Yeah, so I think the vision for Cartridge is to enable these fully on-chain experiences in autonomous worlds. And just before maybe we go down that path, I'll just briefly mention like what is a fully on-chain game. A fully on-chain game is a game where all of the state and the logic lives entirely on the blockchain, at least like in some rollup that settles onto a blockchain like Ethereum and inherits a lot of the properties of the underlying blockchain. So it has properties like a game that can live forever, or a game that has like very strong or guarantees about the availability and the way that it can evolve over time, or a property called hardness, like that you can build things on top of it and have confidence that you're not going to get rugged by the API provider, which is kind of how traditional games are operated today. If you build something successful on top of an existing game, in a lot of cases, they will incorporate that into the core IP, and you can't really build like an interesting, sustainable product on top of it, as well as like you can't build deep integrations with the back end of traditionals. So that's like a fully on-chain game. And then there's this idea of autonomous worlds, which is essentially an extension of it, which are fully on-chain games that have this property of extensibility and composability, and this ability for people to essentially like permissionally extend the universe, so have some core primitives that live on chain, and then be able to create like new experiences very easily on top of it, or even propose like changes to the low level, the laws or the rules of the game, so like the physics of the game, for example, introduce like new items. And there's a lot of space for exploration around there, but it enables essentially like fully community-owned digital universes that can live forever and can evolve over time. So the vision for Cartridge is essentially to help realize this. And we are operating in a bunch of different dimensions to do that. One of them is creating content. So we have the Roll Your Own game, and we have some other titles that we're working on publishing. The other is like the contributions to Dojo. So Dojo itself is a public good. It's a community effort that we started in conjunction with the Realms team and the Brick team, and now has grown to be quite a significant number of contributors, of people that are passionate about the space and contributing to the core pieces that are necessary across like different games. So we can talk a little bit more about what those are. And then Cartridge, right now, the thing that we're focusing is basically providing managed infrastructure around this. So we have a service called Slot that allows you to take a game that you're developing and very easily deploy it into our sequencer Katana and the Index Satori into a managed infrastructure that we facilitate, and you can start doing playtesting with other players. And the goal eventually is to achieve or enable this idea of fractal scaling, which is a pattern that we can use for spinning up different katana sequencers in that kind of a recursive fashion. So you can have like a tree of katana instances that allows us to scale the compute available to serve like thousands of our participants in the on-chain gaming ecosystem. And so like that, that's the current vision in that regard is basically just enabling that. Like, how can we have fully on-chain games that have tens of thousands of concurrent users in production. And so that's a little bit of a ramble, but that's where we're going.
I mean, you've covered the majority of the topics we wanted to discuss today, so that's great. There'll be more things to dig in. No, that's interesting. So Cartridge, it's really for the moment, it's really building infrastructure. It's like a platform for developers, and at some point, you also want it to be like an entry point for actual users, like players, or because when you look today at the Cartridge website, it's a repository of games that you can play. So you really have these two components. On the one hand, you focused on developing infrastructure and providing a platform for builders of on-chain games, but at the same time, you want it to be a platform for users.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, so I think, the way that we think about it is because we're actually building content ourselves, and we have a very close relationship with a bunch of other people building content and the community in the Dojo ecosystem. We're building the things that are necessary, like in the next few months as these games start to mature. So the first thing is obviously you build a game locally. We've enabled now with Dojo that we started developing at the beginning of this year. We've got a very robust toolchain that makes it very easy for people to start building fully on-chain games. And the next natural step is how do I play it with my friends, right? Right now, we're still very close to the developer, and we're kind of building up over time. But so when you deploy a game to Katana with Tori, for example, you can just use burner wallets, and it gives you a really nice user experience. The next thing is how do we enable discovery? So we have a product that is called World Explorer that we haven't officially announced yet, but it's similar to what you're describing. I don't know if you've seen the new Cartridge website, because the new website is more of just a marketing page, and we have some of the games listed below. But we have a version that's coming out in the next few weeks that is an on-chain game explorer. So it's something similar to, for example, Etherscan or StarkScan in the Starknet ecosystem. But it's a higher level of abstraction. It understands the semantics of the world of an on-chain game, and that's a way for players, but also developers. Initially, it's actually focused more at developers, allowing them to write the backend, kind of logic that lives on the blockchain for their game, and then interact with it in a generic way, like a front end. So you don't have to build the client for the game and the server for the game in order to make progress, because we want to make it very quick for individuals and small teams to spin these things up. But eventually is going to be focused on kind of the distribution and the maintenance and the life cycle of fully on-chain games or autonomous worlds, and being an entry point for players into it. But I think we're really just trying to solve the problems that people are facing today with building these things, and try and solve them. Because we're building a little bit of the ecosystem, we start to see these problems early, and then we create solutions for them. And then as other people start to run into the same problems, we have an abstract or tool infrastructure that they can use to address it. And over time, I imagine it'll get closer and closer to the user. I know you guys are familiar with the Cartridge controller that we developed last year, which again was a solution to a problem. Is not necessarily that one to create a wallet. I really actually don't really want to be in the wallet space, especially when we have such a great solution like Argent already. We could just be a little bit better and support WebAuthn. But once
that's coming, no worry.
So once you guys address that, then there's a bunch of challenges for developers and building on-chain in Starknet or just generally in the blockchain space. And then there's a bunch of challenges with onboarding users, especially on-chain games where you have, the transactions are much more frequent, and they're very different from DeFi transactions, for example, where you very infrequent high-value things. In this case, you have very frequent low-value transactions. So just building, if necessary, building up products to help with that.
You define really well on-chain games by opposition of Web3 games, and I think people might not realize that most Web3 games are just normal games where you end up minting some NFTs. So I think a fully on-chain state that's pretty exciting. How do you differentiate between on-chain games and autonomous world? Do you see just world as a broader concept that might not be games, or where games might run on top of the world or inside the world, I should say, or how do you see those two concepts?
Yeah, so I think the distinction between Web3 or some people call Web 2.5 kind of games is that they just take advantage of this one property of the blockchain, which is asset ownership. And outside of that, all of the game exists off-chain, which basically means that it introduces essentially an oracle problem, right? The value of your asset that you're actually investing in that you own on the blockchain is still defined by something that is completely external from it, and you could easily be rugged by the developer, as an example. So on-chain game is obviously a transition of the removal of that that oracle problem by putting all the actual game logic on-chain, and then I would say the autonomous world is really defined by this ability to permissionlessly extend and compose the world, like over time, that it can grow. It's not just a single experience. It has the ability to have it's modular in the sense that there's like maybe some level of physics defined in the universe. There's like some lore that's been created, and then there's like potentially multiple different on-chain games that can be developed on top of it. I think like the analog in the traditional gaming world is probably something like Warcraft, or it's pretty common with different IPs where you have like the universe, and then you have like a bunch of different experiences built on top of that. And I think like it's kind of a similar idea as you have and this like more abstract universe, and then you have like these concrete kind of implementations of different ways to experience that lore or that universe.
It's really it makes me think about. Sorry, go ahead, Julian. Yeah.
No, I wanted to say for me, it really clicked. I would say a year ago, I was a judge in a hackathon from Matchbox DAO, which is a DAO focusing on gaming, who was focusing on gaming on Starknet. I remember that I would say 2/3 of the projects were actually building on Rails. And that I found really fascinating, because they were either creating games within that world, or they were actually extending that world by bringing new capabilities. Like there was someone that built like an emperor feature where people could basically delegate their army to someone, and that people would basically manage their armies in that world for them. And so for me, it really clicked, the ability to say Realm it's just a world. And then people, like, they didn't ask, it wasn't part of the hackathon. They just decided to build within that world, to build a new game or a new feature or something different within the boundaries of that world. And for me, I thought it was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. The Realms team and the Realms ecosystem is definitely on like the forefront of this exploration. And a lot of them are actually building on Dojo. I think there's maybe like 10 different experiences now in the Realms ecosystem that are building on Dojo. And another like interesting answer to what you mentioned is the Realms team published a game called Loot Survivor, and Loot Survivor is what's called a play to die game. So it's like you play, and it's live on mainnet on Starknet today. So you should definitely check that out if you haven't already. But the concept is you like start a game and you play a session of this game and you progress your adventurer, and then eventually your adventurer dies. And like that's that game, like the play the game, you get like some high score. And now another team is creating a new game called like Rising Revenant, where you can take your dead adventurer from Loot Survivor and you can use it in their game. So it's like this interesting dynamic, like they're kind of taking the output of this first game, Loot Survivor, as like the input of their game, and so even to play their game, you have to first play this other game. And it's such an interesting concept of like how these things can emergent kind of experiences can be built.
You mentioned something on more of the technical stack side. You mentioned Katana sequencer made for gaming. What's different? How does something like Katana differs from the Starknet sequencer or something like Madara? What does gaming on-chain games need that differs from traditional sequencers?
Yeah, I would say like traditional sequencers. So it's more of a question of like what are the properties that you want for these experiences. So almost all sequencers today are designed with DeFi in mind. And so for decentralized finance, you want as the name obviously suggests, you want like centralized like sequencer set, right? In a lot of cases for multiple reasons. One of them being censorship resistance, but the other potentially like regulatory arbitrage and things like that. And as soon as you start to decentralize something, you introduce like a lot of overhead because on the performance side, because you have to like you have to have parameters that are set that allows people to communicate across like distances, especially if you want to decentralize a sequence set across the world, then you naturally your blockchain is like limited by the speed of light, of like how fast can a sequencer between different like these areas that communicate to come to consensus on something. With Katana, we're specifically focused on like centralized sequencing. We're willing to trade off like censorship resistance for performance, or to have low latency. In a lot of games, we want to deploy a Katana sequencer like close to a user. So like geographically, if you're in Europe, you want to interact with a sequencer in Europe, and you want like a very low latency. You want to be able to have like 50 milliseconds for your transaction to be essentially like soft confirmed by the sequencer to give the player a great experience. So that's one of the things. And removing the decentralized component like significantly simplifies the sequencer implementation. So like Katana is also like a great reference implementation for just like a very simple sequencer, and people are using it actually for other applications as well, order books and stuff where they don't necessarily aren't necessarily concerned with the decentralized side of things. And then there's some additional features that we're interested in introducing to Katana that we haven't we're going to keep under wraps for a little bit longer. But I think there's like substantial kind of space to differentiate a gaming specific sequencer from a more like generic implementation that's focused primarily on DeFi.
And in a world where you spin up a sequencer next to me, let's say in Europe, how do you still have a challenge about sharing the states between these various sequencer? Like you're in the US, you will have a sequencer in the US, I'll have one in Europe. How are we sharing the same online experience in such a scenario?
Yeah, so I think you can think of, with the fractal scaling roadmap, right? There's multiple different levels. You have, Ethereum obviously securing like as the anchor of the system, and then you have like a layer 2, like Starknet, which is maybe like the global execution context. And so you want to share state, like for example, if you have like an auction house or something inside of your game, you probably want like people to communicate, like be able to interact with the shared state across like the world, and there's not like a low latency requirement there. And then in the case of like a session of a game or a dungeon or something that you're playing with your friends, or if you typically in games you're paired with people that are geographically close to you, and you can with the properties that are enabled by zero knowledge proofs and what we enable with Dojo on top of the Starknet stack in Cairo is the ability to spin up a sequencer for a particular session of a game. So maybe it's just a dungeon run with you and 5 friends, for example. It'll be initialized with some state that comes from the layer below. But once it's initialized, like that state all exists in that sequencer, you can do some series of events or a bunch of transactions or steps like kill the boss or whatever. And then at the end of that, you can generate a proof for that entire, just settle the proof that says like, look, Itamar killed the boss, and you settle that to the layer 2, and you can unlock the loot there. So you have, this is really, I think one of the interesting parts of what's enabled by Dojo is you have this ability to have essentially this like fully off-chain experience, but you generate a zero knowledge proof that attests to the integrity of this computation, and then settle it back onto the blockchain like Starknet or maybe potentially some other settlement layer. And everyone is completely convinced that you defeated the boss. They don't know how you defeated the boss. But you get the loot from it, and you get the loot inside of like the global context on Starknet, so that you can show it off to like anyone in the world, kind of thing.
Isn't it like a bit like a state channel in a sense? Your sequencer is like a facilitator for a ZK state channel.
Yeah, I think it's similar to like a ZK state channel. I think like the kind of the nuance there is like ZK state channels are typically like synchronously proved, right? So you have. If you have what people refer to as a ZK state channel, it's like I prove something and then I give you the proof. You verify the proof, and then you extend that proof, or you you generate your proof, and then you have this like proof generation time is essentially like the latency between interactions. With the sequencer, we do all the proving asynchronously, so it allows you to have like high throughput interactions inside of the experience.
It's actually a very different version of fractal scaling that we typically hear out there, because when people think fractal scaling, we talk a lot these days about app chains. They are very segregated experience, and you see now more and more apps creating their own app chain. But they are, every app chain is one application. It doesn't really need to talk to another one, and you will use the layer below just to move assets between app chains, to bridge assets. Well, here what you're saying is you could have a single world, a single large experience, but then thousands of sequencers on demand coming in and out into play. And so you're scaling a single experience in that fractal way. Quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And like maybe sequencer is not the exact right word for this. I think we sometimes refer to it as like a stateful coprocessor. It has like very similar properties to a coprocessor. Except for it has like some state during its execution, where most coprocessors are typically like pure functions. But you could still have like persistent. So, for example, in the Realms ecosystem, like Eternum is a persistent world, and you could run Eternum as like a single like global. You could have like multiple Eternum persistent worlds by geography. So you may have like a U.S. server, which is like common for games, right? Like it's different from applications. Like Twitter doesn't have like a U.S. East, right? Twitter version. But games, it's very common to have like a U.S. East server, or like the server for Asia, or partitioned geographically. So you might still have like a persistent sequencer for the Eternum world, and then on top of that, like like now you're talking like layer 4 or whatever, you can have these ephemeral like sequencers or katana instances that are spun up for different experiences on top of that.
The way I imagine it is you have a big casino. The state is shared because everyone has an amount of funds, for example. But then I'm being called on the poker table, and the 5 of us will spin up a sequencer. We'll play a poker game or tournament, and then when it's done, we settle back onto the casino. And so it's very ephemeral experience there. Exactly. Like a burner sequencer. It's very interesting concept.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the fundamental challenge with blockchains is you have like this shared execution context where you, if you want to have like a single global state, and everyone's competing for these resources. And so in the case of games, almost all games, even in traditional architectures, are designed in a way that you have there's very few parts of the game that have like a single global context. I mean, most games have none of that. Almost all games are these like kind of session-based, like smaller subset of users, and it doesn't make sense to run, thousands of dungeons in the same execution context where they're competing for resources, because it's very easy to shard that execution. They have their own state that they're in with, and they have no interaction between them. And so essentially, what we're doing is building an architecture that enables that.
At the very beginning, before we started, you mentioned being in Istanbul for Autonomous World, and I think you said, "Oh, great!" Was there a typical, like an emerging trend, or something that you took out of that felt quite new, or an upcoming trend?
I would say, I think like. The cool thing is, a year ago we've had similar events to this, but it was all in theory. This year there's actual experiences that are being shipped, primarily in the mod and in the Dojo ecosystem, and there was actually a bunch of playtesting at the Autonomous World Assembly. I think like it's still too early to have like a very well-defined trend. Like people are still trying to figure out what works. There's definitely, session-based games like that Loot Survivor, or this play-to-die concept, and similar to what we built with Roll Your Own, I think is one kind of approach that people are experimenting with. I think like the next space for it, where there's a lot of interest, is enabling hidden information inside of games, which is obviously important for many games that are essentially adversarial environments. Like, how do you introduce secrets into a blockchain where everything is public? And so there's a lot of thought going into that around, like using zero knowledge proofs as well as like other approaches to enable things. Like one of them is called, for example, witness encryption, which is this like idea that there's some information that no one knows until someone discovers it. Like not even the developer of the game knows, and how to try and enable those, or at least like pseudo versions of that. So there's definitely more and more mindshare being dedicated there. Let me think. I wouldn't say there's necessarily like a clear trend right now. It's just a lot of different experimentation, and there's quite a vast design space. So everyone's kind of doing somewhat different stuff.
Can you? So the Autonomous World was at Dev Connect. I guess there's people building on DVM, people building on Starknet. Can you maybe explain why you're building on Starknet? And if you see differences in the on-chain ecosystem in Starknet with respect to the one on EVM, for example, or if people are just, or it's just one collectible, community with the same objective. Differences within the Starknet ecosystem and the one on the EVM?
There's a couple different things. Like there's the community, I would say, is very collaborative. We, being so early, we learn a lot from each other. There's essentially, this is like a new emerging ecosystem in its infancy. And I think, it's not like us versus them inside of the on-chain games autonomous worlds ecosystem. It's like really this as a new idea versus all of the existing ideas of what constitutes a game. And we're like massive underdogs. So it doesn't make sense for us to kind of PvP internally. So everyone, I would say, is relatively collaborative in that regard, whether it's EVM or StarkNet. The autonomous world assembly was more ideas focused. So focus on being a venue for people to communicate the things that they've learned from building on-chain games and less about the particular technology that they're using. Between EVM and StarkNet, there's obviously different. Most of the EVM, the games in the EVM space are built with mud and are deployed to optimistic rollups. And then we have StarkNet being the Cairo VM and being a ZK rollup. There's different properties that they enable and different trade-offs between them. And I think there's actually a big opportunity for them to be complementary, to accomplish different things inside of, like, I think potentially, a large successful game will touch both of these ecosystems. The reason that we decided to build on StarkNet, so StarkNet, I was introduced to StarkNet by Parama when he came to the Doughboys DAO and suggested building this fully on-chain game on top of StarkNet. That was basically 2 years ago now, very early on in the ecosystem. And I would say it's like the fundamental property of zero-knowledge proofs or validity to scale the amount of computation that kind of sold me that this was the right approach to go. And this kind of fractal scaling architecture, which has been around for a relatively long time, that this is possible, but it's taken a long time to achieve. And we're still working towards that. But I felt that it was the right approach to scaling computation for on-chain games. Having StarkNet in Cairo being a language that's specifically designed around zero-knowledge proofs and being able to efficiently produce proofs gives us some interesting properties in the Dojo stack. For example, you write smart contracts that, and itself, as you know, is a great language. And it's taken a lot of lessons from Solidity, and they've created a really nice way to write smart contracts. So baseline, I've spent a lot of time writing Solidity, and I really enjoy running Cairo, and the tooling has significantly improved over time. But there's some fundamental properties that it gives you that you can't get from like a ZK EVM. For example, being able to client-side prove it. So Solidity in theory, or it's possible to prove. There's obviously ZK EVMs that exist, but they take like very large servers to be able to prove them, and a lot of memory, especially due to the use of the different hashing functions aren't friendly for a proving system. Whereas Cairo is very feasible to prove on the client side. So you can have the same code that you write that defines the on-chain world, and the same code and define like the client-side components of it in the same language. So from a developer experience perspective, that's very nice. And then I think the community in StarkNet has been a really massive asset as well. Like over the last 2 years participating, and it's very collaborative and a lot of really intelligent people. So I think a combination of those different components is why I've decided to focus on the StarkNet ecosystem. And I would say today the on-chain gaming space is almost like 50% EVM, 50% StarkNet, which is a great accomplishment for the ecosystem, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely quite impressive. By the way, you mentioned a few times Dojo. I've actually been playing with Dojo this week because I wanted to see what would be the experience using Argent and Dojo. And I must say that I was actually very, very impressed. Like, you have a 15 minutes ECS quick start, and it actually worked in 15 minutes, which usually is never the case, right? You need to install different software, different things, and I mean, by experience, it never works the first time, and actually it works like amazingly smoothly. So yeah, I wanted to mention that if people are interested, don't be afraid. You should really give it a try. Go to Dojo, and I mean, every single one of the component worked. I launched Katana. I could migrate my wall there. I used Story. I mean, everything was actually working really well, which is very impressive. You're working on multiple fronts with Dojo, Cartridge. What's your I would say main focus today, and what do you think is the main next challenge that you'll need to tackle?
But so actually today specifically, I've been working on getting. Brick is doing a production deployment of Dojo in I think like a few weeks from now. And there's some last things I wanted to make sure that are tied up inside of the Dojo on-chain stuff before they do that as part of this current version. So I think that's was my focus today, specifically because obviously very exciting to have a production deployment on StarkNet mainnet of a Dojo application, the brick universe. But more generally, we're trying to figure out, how to the roadmap of how to deliver these things that we've been talking about. We have today, we've made like a ton of progress, and it's great to hear that you had a great experience onboarding. And we spent a lot of time trying to refine that experience. Particularly, Loaf has spent a bunch of time on the documentation and the developer onboarding side, and has done a really great job there. But we have like the baseline stuff. We can kind of do everything that like the EVM can do today inside of Dojo. And now we're starting to push out onto the frontiers of things like client-side proving and proof aggregation and stuff like actually settling Katana chains. So I think the next few months is going to be characterized by that. How do we take games that people can build games and they can play games with their friends on Katana instances that they spin up in Cartridge's managed infrastructure offering is called Slot. And now the next step is to how do we put these Katana instances into production and actually start settling to StarkNet or other, you could potentially essentially settle to Ethereum itself or really any EVM chain. Like how can we enable that? So I think that's going to be the big next step, and is that's like the interface between Cartridge and Dojo on executing on that. And then in parallel, we're on the content side, we're working towards defining a new title that we want to develop that is a lot more ambitious and incorporates like a lot of these new technologies that we're starting to introduce.
Okay, so basically you need a prover on your toolchain, a prover and a verifier, whether the verifier is on StarkNet. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So there's and the great thing about it is it aligns very well with Modera, the effort towards settling Modera, right? So like we have the Stone prover, which is we can use today, and we have Sharp that we can use today. And the Katana instance uses the same like Cairo VM and Blockifier as Modera, so it generates the same like execution trace and stuff like this. And so working in collaboration with those guys to enable settlements of both of these. And it just as like a side note, like one of the cool properties that things that zero knowledge proofs enables is we can amortize settlement costs across like Modera and Katana instances, and even like if we wanted to settle to Ethereum, it can be aggregated across like StarkNet, Katana, and Modera. So as we have more and more usage of the stack, the settlements costs and the fees actually go down, which is kind of a crazy property.
If we take a step back, so I think the tech is evolving super quickly. I think what do we need for content, for actual games? So for content to really take off and get us to expand beyond the current crypto niche, I would say. Well, it's getting larger and larger, but how do we create, I don't like to use the word mainstream, but the more accessible, larger on-chain game? What is missing? What's the next step there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think like there's generally two approaches. Like one is, coming from top down and someone's funding a studio with tens of millions of dollars and trying to produce a AAA game. And we saw a lot of that in kind of the Web 2.5 like NFT ecosystem of people promising very ambitious games. And then the other approach is like these more organic bottoms-up ecosystems, like grassroots that start to spawn and experiment with a bunch of different possibilities. And that's what we see today in the Realms ecosystem and Dope Wars and just generally the Dojo ecosystem, and as well as these other efforts, is just a lot of different people building small experiences and trying to figure out like what are the interesting new mechanics that are enabled by the blockchain. And I think, in my opinion, it's probably I think like the biggest on-chain games or autonomous worlds that exist 5 or 10 years from now are going to be ones that started today and grew in a very similar fashion to a blockchain itself, like Ethereum, that started as a bunch of different people experimenting with different things, and then eventually found some level of product market fit, and the progress can kind of compound on each other, and people can start to build more and more interesting experiences over time. And I think like what really needs to happen is just a lot of experimentation around like what it looks like to build a fun game that it lives entirely on the blockchain. And then once we have something like that, we can obviously, blockchain has proven pretty good at creating new IP. We've seen it with, Bored Apes and all these NFT projects. And the intersection of those two things of using the cryptoeconomic incentive structures and the ownership of the blockchain and actual fun games, I think, will allow us to build experiences as well as like obviously the technology to scale it that are appealing to a large set of users or players. And they potentially don't need to know that they're interacting with the blockchain underneath. I think that is an important part of it as well.
Interesting your point around whether it will be large studio with AAA game or new organic smaller teams. If you look at the platform shift in gaming, I'm looking at, I'm a bit older probably than you. First it was Facebook games. It was not EA, it was Zynga, it was Playfish at the time. It was completely new players that took advantage of the platform shift, and it became social game. They found out how to leverage the social element. If we look at mobile, it was actually not Zynga, for example. It was probably Rovio with Angry Birds, because they thought about new UX, new dynamic of the touchscreen. So every new platform has created new multi-billion-dollar game company. So there's clearly an option for the second option to be the winning one, a scenario where it's a new organic company, a new small team that figured that out rather than large incumbent. I like that approach.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, one of the powerful things about on-chain games and autonomous worlds is this ability for players to like have a much more sincere relationship with them and feel like they're actually stakeholders in them, which is, kind of orthogonal to like the top-down AAA approach. Where in those cases is often a single publisher that wants to maintain a lot of control for obvious reasons from just from an investment perspective and what their incentives are. So I think like an organic ecosystem like Realms is very robust. It's already lived for like multiple years on a much smaller budget than a lot of these AAA. It's produced a lot of very interesting content, and a lot of people are passionate about it and come to the community and produce these things for free. And there's a lot of experimentation on the different types of games that can exist in the ecosystem. And I think like that long term creates a much more robust foundation and is able to demonstrate these properties of the blockchain much more than I think eventually in 5-10 years, like once something's very successful, we'll see essentially something similar to like the L1 phase of blockchains, where there will be like a bunch of overcapitalized like existing studios come in and try and be like, oh, we're going to make the next best autonomous world. And it's like, we're just going to throw a bunch of money at it. But none of them are going to be able to compete with like kind of the network effects that the existing ones have, similar to how no L1 could compete with Ethereum, because like people building on Ethereum actually have like a relationship with it, right? And a sincere relationship and commitment to it and a passion for it. Whereas when you spun up these massive VC funded layer ones, it's very transactional. So I think it's an interesting, in my at least opinion, differentiation between what we'll see in successful autonomous worlds in the future.
You mentioned, gamers not even knowing they're on the blockchain. And I think clearly that's a desirable goal, right? To actually attract novel gamers that just want to play a game. How far do you think we are from that becoming a reality? When someone maybe, interested by a game, by a world, by the properties that it brings to them, but they don't need to know it's on blockchain, and they would just come to play a game. I mean, today, you still need to know it's on the blockchain, and it's still very blockchainy because of wallets, because of a lot of things. How far do you think we are from that experience where actually, I can tell my young cousin or my young nephew, who's into gaming, you can try that game, that's a pretty good one. And you turn out that it will be on the blockchain, but it doesn't need to know about it.
I think we're actually relatively close to being able to do that. I mean, particularly, so if you think about, there's the one thing on the onboarding side with wallet. So if you play Roll Your Own, for example, we create a burner wallet for a player, and they just click play and play the game. And if you didn't know it was on the blockchain, you wouldn't say it was on the blockchain. And you have this like interesting dynamic with with the fractal scaling or what we're doing with Katana, where you can allow someone to play a game for free because there's no transaction fees because they're not executing in the same zero-sum like execution context. So they're not competing with other people for like priority to include a transaction in Ethereum or layer 2 or whatever. You can allow them to play a full game, and only at the end of the game, if they were excited about the outcome, do they need to like settle that to the blockchain. And only really costs money. Like plain execution is obviously very cheap. So you start doing experiences that look very similar to free-to-play experiences in traditional games. So you can create, someone can join a game, create just a burner wallet in the browser, play a game, and then like once they've actually had fun and unlocked like an item or some achievement or something, and they want to like save that, do they need to onboard? So we can remove like this entire like upfront overhead that we have today in the blockchain space. To be something that the user has like a stronger incentive to do later on when they actually settle it to the blockchain and save their progress essentially. So I think I think that. So from a technical perspective, I think that's a very promising approach. There's still and it's completely possible today. There's still some engineering effort in actually realizing it. I think it's maybe like 6 months away from being production ready or so. But I think once we can do that, there's a lot of different experiences that we can create for players where they don't necessarily know that they're on the blockchain. With the account abstraction and paymasters and all these things, you can start to create different models for paying for transaction fees as well. So I think we're relatively close.
That's very exciting.
What do you
We'll
think?
definitely take care of the wallet side.
Yeah.
I mean, for us being on an account abstraction only chain, so a chain that only has account abstraction makes life really good. Like it's much easier to build. We deliver much faster. So I know you have a long wish list. Things like Web 10. That's something we're working on. I think this morning or yesterday we started testing session keys with the team I see here in the in the space. So there will be really a big acceleration, I think, in new experience, and gaming is probably the vertical. I mean, outside DeFi is where we come from. Gaming is probably where we are heading in terms of how much we're hiding the wallet, how much we're abstracting everything.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
On the one thing that I wonder how you feel around the challenge of making games more mainstream, and at the same time the pushback we get from the mobile industry. So Apple challenge around buying gaming assets or paying with crypto will there's no clear move on that side. So you still depend on their in-app purchase model gatekeepers. Do you think we'll first see large games on desktop in the browser before they come to mobile, or is mobile a prerequisite?
I think it's a great question. I mean, obviously, like native mobile experiences are a huge audience of players today. Most blockchain games have taken the browser web-based approach, and look, the ecosystem looks much more similar to Flash games of like the early 2000s. I think there's like the Apple's going to enable side loading in the EU at least, if I understood correctly, which obviously would create an avenue for having native experiences without like the 30% gatekeeping fee. I mean, the challenge with the gatekeeping fee is what the blame is essentially people can just arbitrage that difference and can actually just lose a bunch of money if you're not careful as a publisher in the space. A lot of the experiences that people are building today are what's called progressive web apps, which are relatively robust today. So roll your own again we actually designed it to be mobile first. I think the mobile experience is really great. I don't know if I can share a link to that so people can check it out. I don't know how that works. But yeah, there's a few different teams building progressive web apps, and not just an application that loads in Safari and has some persistent state, and you can add it to your home screen and sidesteps a lot of these challenges, but it's still not possible to do things that you can do in a native application, especially like when you want to do like 3D rendering and stuff like that. So it's definitely still a bit of a challenge. And as well as if you start to think about like how do you put on-chain games onto a console like an Xbox or a PlayStation, right? Like you really need the platform buy-in to be able to do that well. So I think, in the short term, we'll definitely be mostly browser-based, progressive web apps, and long-term, hopefully there's a solution, not just for on-chain games, but for the blockchain ecosystem more broadly.
Interesting. I had a question around whether you felt there was one geo, one country that would take up first. I didn't ask it because I didn't feel there were, but actually your point around side loading on Apple platform on iOS could be a trigger for one region to really take off on chain games just because of that. I could see that as a catalyst, and you're right. It's in theory it's supposed to be happening. I think in 2024. I don't know much about the latest on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think historically the things that when Apple's forced to do something in Europe, they end up just kind of doing it for the whole world. So that I think this is some hope that eventually we'll get that in the US as well and in other markets as well.
You get USB-C thanks to us, indeed.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Go ahead, Julien. Go.
No, I was going to say, I think we have a couple of minutes left. I don't know exactly how this works. I hope we won't be shut down without us having the time to wrap up. But I wanted to thank you again, Tarrence, for being on this podcast, and this discussion. That's been very interesting. What is the next conference you're going to? When is the next time we get to meet in person?
Well, I'm going to Slush in Helsinki, like very briefly next week. But I imagine you guys probably won't be there. I think
no, I don't think so.
Yeah, maybe the next. Generally, I try not to go to a lot of conferences, but especially they all seem to be in Europe, which is relatively far away. Nice for you guys, though. Maybe ETH Denver. I don't know if you guys plan to go to ETH Denver. That's going to be, I think, in March.
Maybe we might be there.
February,
cool,
March
very
time.
cool.
Yeah.
Slush used to be my top conference in the past. It's really awesome, and you have a lot of gaming company there. I don't know if you plan to meet Supercell, or I think Rovio is also there. Definitely a great gaming ecosystem in Finland.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm participating. There's a Future in Gaming side event that I'm participating in, so that's the reason I'm making the journey.
Cool. And
Awesome.
as a last question, we usually ask our people who join us on this call, who would you invite next for the next episode of Insider Chats? Which you want to see on it, and why?
That's a good question. I think if I'm biased towards the on-chain gaming ecosystem, then I would maybe suggest Loaf and talk a little bit more about like the Realms ecosystem, and because I think it's really impressive what they've been able to build over there. And just more generally in the Starknet ecosystem, maybe someone, I don't know if you guys have spoken to someone from the Giza team, where they're doing verifiable.
Oh, that's a very good idea. We know Fran. It's a very good idea, actually. Quite different from what we've done so far.
Yeah, I think Fran would be a great guest. And the Giza team is really solid, building very cool stuff as well.
Awesome. But thanks so much. I think my last word would be that if you're in this space and you're based in London, you should leave the space and head up to the Starknet meetup that we're organizing. It's starting literally now. So head to Shoreditch. As usual, it's every month. Every month's a meetup, and every month a Twitter space. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks again, Tarrence, and we'll see you hopefully very soon.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tarrence. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.